I'm Nikki, one of the archivists for the British Empire and Commonwealth collection at Bristol Culture. Welcome to the talk on Building Shared Futures, which is part of a series of events that we're running for Black History Month. Now, if we just focus in on these people in the picture for a moment, I unfortunately can't tell you any of their names. I do know that the photo was taken in a community centre in Nairobi in the late 1960s, possibly the Kaloleni Social Hall. But as for the boys themselves, who are they and what were their stories? Do they still live in the same community? What benefits would they say that boxing training brought to their lives? During Black History Month each year, we aim to raise awareness of resources which document the history and achievements of Black people. One of the legacies of the British Empire is that British people who worked overseas obviously took photos and films of the countries they visited. And then when they returned, these valuable resources came with them. And the economic inequalities that underpin the empire meant that in many cases early on, they might have been the only people with a camera or a cine camera in that place at that time. And yet often, these photos survive in such small numbers in amongst their other albums of family snaps or pictures of England that sending the albums to museums in their countries of origin isn't an option either. In the British Empire and Commonwealth collection at Bristol Archives, we hold a large number of photos, films and documents that fall into this category. And you can see, obviously, examples of some of these photos scrolling now, each of them remarkable and unremarkable at the same time. Often they show ordinary people doing ordinary things, but they all tell a story, not just of the people and their families, but their communities, workplaces, sporting achievements. And in many cases, as with the boys who were boxing, those stories haven't been told. And we recognise that it's not really acceptable for people in countries in the former empire to lack access to these materials on their own history. And we feel a responsibility to find ways of putting this right. It's also, of course, the case that many citizens of the former empire came to Britain and elsewhere, and their descendants now form part of diaspora communities, which can sometimes lack ways of feeling connected to their family heritage. And Building Shared Futures, or BSF, as I'll probably refer to it from now on, is just one small step that we've taken on this journey. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today. So Building Shared Futures, BSF, is a partnership between us, the Beck team at Bristol Archives, the University of Bristol, and academics and heritage institutions in Kenya. And it started in 2018 after we realised just how rich our Kenyan photographic collections were, particularly in showing the development of Nairobi, its infrastructure and industries, and how those photos included a lot of pictures of things which are still within living memory. And we felt a kind of overwhelming sense that we had to do something with these images because we felt they had something to say to people living in Kenya and elsewhere now. And we had to at least try to do something to get them out there. And we felt if we could make some connections and pilot some new ways of working, then this could be something that we could expand elsewhere. In just one little example, we know that rally driving was really popular amongst Kenyan Asians in the 1950s and 60s. And several of the most successful competitors, like Joginder Singh, known as the Flying Sikh at the time, later migrated to Britain. And these people are mentioned by name in dozens of photo captions, but their descendants are almost certainly unaware that the photos even exist. So we shared the idea with our advisory board, and to cut a long story short, in early 2018, the University of Bristol paid for the digitisation of 2,000 images as a kind of taster, and for 2 academics to go out to Nairobi. They made connections with Kenyan academics and curators who were keen to look at the images and find out more about how we could work together. And that included staff from the National Museums of Kenya and academics in history, architecture and art history from various universities in Nairobi. And those people, along with us, became the core of our BSF team. And once we had our team together, we were successful in applying for money for the next phase of the project from Bristol University's Global Challenges Research Fund, which is money set aside for collaborations between developed countries and the global south, which will benefit developing countries by sharing skills and resources. Now, the next slide that I'm going to show really sums up the overall aim of BSF. So I'll kind of let that speak for itself because I can't really improve on it. This is broadly the aim of the project, which underpins everything that we've been working on. And we've been clear from the start that everything we do is collaborative. You know, it's not us rehashing the British Empire by saying this is what we think is good for you. It's been very much about working together. And it is sharing. You know, we know that there are similar images in archives and museums in Kenya, and also within the community, especially on online forums like seekheritage.org, which has an incredibly rich treasure trove of historic images. But resources are lacking, meaning that even the images which are still within Kenya aren't as accessible to everyone as, you know, would ideally be happening. And this lack of access has a consequence for the future development of the city, which I'll be coming on to. So in order to get the material more widely accessed, the first step was more digitization. And it was obvious to us from the start that the Kenyan team members had to make the selections because they needed to choose what material they felt would speak to people in their communities. So 6 Kenyan team members came over to Bristol Archives for a week in Easter 2019. And we just got out pretty much everything we had on Kenya and said, what do you want digitized? You know, what gaps do you feel exist in archives holdings in Kenya as a result of things ending up in the UK after the empire ended? And how can we do something about that? So we then ended up with another 2,000 images from around 1910 to the 1970s, including some of the ones that you'll see today, in all sorts of different formats and conditions, slides, albums, negatives. And we've digitized those and made them available on our online catalogue. And I've just included this quote here because Lydia told me afterwards that when she walked in on the first day, she was quite skeptical because she'd never even heard of Bristol. And she was thinking, quite understandably, what could Bristol have to tell me about Kenya? But then during that day, she opened a box of letters and found the name of a family member written on a document, which was an incredible moment. And I think after that, we really came together as a team because it really brought home how much we were working towards this shared goal. But getting the images digitized and online is obviously only the first stage. Another key part of the project was development work by the University of Bristol's research IT team to create a pilot resource where we can upload these images and people can access them on smartphones or whatever and add their own captions, their own stories. And it is only a pilot. There's still an awful lot of work to be done as part of the next phase, both on adding content and on development. But long term, it will be hosted in Kenya, probably by the national museums, and they would have ownership of it going forward. And it works by the user selecting a pin on the map, possibly from the street corner they're standing on at that moment or whatever, and then they can see a photo of what was in that spot years ago, together with the catalogue description. Or you don't even have to use the map if you don't want to. You can just use this screen to scroll through the gallery of images. Now, we're still seeking funding to expand this pilot, but in the meantime, we're going to be working on a social media campaign where we put photos out there into the community and encourage people to respond and get talking about them. And the idea is that that will build up some engagement around the images. And then when the eventual site launches properly, we'll already have followers and people that are engaged with it and ready to contribute and take it forward. So by June last year, we'd digitized several thousand of these images. We'd got the pilot website up, and then 3 of us went to Kenya for a week, 2 from the University of Bristol and me from Bristol Archives. And this was where we spent some time looking at photos held in archives and museums in Nairobi and started to think more about some actual uses of the material. And spending some time in Nairobi in the company of local people, seeing the city warts and all, it's very apparent that there's a lot of inward investment and development at the moment, but that much of it isn't taking on board the interests of local people or their heritage. And as a consequence, the appetite for access to heritage material is greater than ever and growing all the time. And with it, the scope to prove to the powers that be that there is interest in the past, and it can't just be ignored in bulldozing old housing estates and replacing community spaces with glass towers. These images here just show Nairobi National Park with the brand new Chinese funded railway line running through the middle of it. And on the right, the municipal market, which has stood in its current spot since the 1930s. And there's just a nice little shot of the municipal market in the 1960s. So one of the traders in the municipal market is a man called Peter Kibui, who also heads up the Residents Association for an estate called Kalaleni. And this is just the BSF team with Peter on the left there. The estate was built for veterans after World War II, and many of the residents that live there even today are descended from the original inhabitants, as Peter explained to us. However, over the years, it's become progressively more run down, and many people in the community feel increasingly powerless against the threat of redevelopment, which they have good reason to fear may not be sensitive to their heritage and their culture. Peter was brought into the project team in Nairobi to give his community's perspective on what it could mean to them to gain access to photographs of Kalaleni in its heyday, as you can see here, and other parts of the city as well. And he felt that residents would have a stronger case against development if they were able to mobilise around the heritage of an area. But it's so much harder to do that when the heritage largely exists in people's memories. And that brings us back to the boys who were boxing in their class in the first photo I showed today. These were actually donated to us quite recently, so long after my trip to Kenya. But anyone who was listening carefully might remember that I believe that photo and this one were taken in the Kalaleni Social Hall, which is now a listed building. A number of the other images which are scrolling now were certainly taken there because we've seen the captions on the back of the photos. And this brings us right up to the minute, as these images have only just been digitized in the last couple of weeks. So we haven't had the chance yet to share them with our Kenyan friends and other people that they know in their communities. But that is certainly our next step, because it would mean a lot to us to be able to trace some of the people in these pictures and find out their stories. And hopefully it would be meaningful to them too. And the great thing about this collection is that compared to some of our photos, which go right back pre-war, there's no reason to believe that a lot of the people in these photos won't still be alive. And as I've said, if we can ultimately set up a system and digital infrastructure for making these images available, then images held by people and organizations locally would also be able to join in with it. And it would hopefully create this real virtuous circle of people sharing things and then more things getting opened up. So I've already mentioned that we're hoping to use social media to start building engagement around some of these images in preparation for continuing with the project in a bigger way. But one of the key outcomes from our Nairobi trip a year ago was an exhibition at the National Museum of Kenya, which was almost a trailer for the rest of the project and almost like a first suggestion of how the images might start to talk to people and how people in the area would find out about the project. Now, it consisted of 10 images from our collection alongside contemporary images of the same or similar places in Nairobi today, taken by a Kenyan photographer. And it was a truly collaborative effort. The Kenyan team members kind of chucked in a load of ideas over WhatsApp of, things they remembered from being children, kind of key iconic places, that kind of thing. And then based on that, I selected a long list of potential places and images. Then the Kenyan team got that down to a short list based on what they felt would speak to local people. And then the photographer picked the final 10 based on what she felt she could respond to best. And after we'd mounted them in the gallery at National Museum of Kenya, we went round together writing the captions. And actually our first taste of the interest in them was when we went to pick up these pictures from the copy shop where the printing had all taken place. And the copy shop owner was there in his office when we went to pick them up. And he was like, "Where did you get these photos? They're amazing. Have you got any more? Have you got any of my street in the 1950s?" And he was just absolutely blown away with them. And we did actually manage to find, when I got back to the office, we did find 2 pictures of the street in Nairobi where the copy shop was based. It wasn't the actual building, but it was the same street with all the old cars and everything like that. And we sent them to him, which was great. So that was just the first kind of taste, really, of how, you know, local people were going to take an interest. So after the exhibition was up in the National Museum of Kenya for 2 months, then the same images were displayed in our foyer at Bristol Archives for 2 months. And it's still available as an online version on our website. And I believe that either Gail or Karen is going to add a link to that into the chat box now. So yeah, anyone who would like to go to that, you can look at that at your leisure. This is one of my favorite photos from the collection. I absolutely love it. It's taken from the pictures of a group of Indian friends who in the 1950s climbed Mount Kilimanjaro and raised the Indian flag on the top. And given that India had only been independent for just over 5 years at this point, that must have been a really incredibly proud moment. With everything that's happened in the world in the last 6 to 8 months, there have been times when we in the BSF team have felt a bit like we're at the bottom of a mountain. Before we left Kenya last summer, we pulled together quite an ambitious plan for the next 3 to 4 years to include developing the website, adding many more digitized images, pulling in more community groups to work with us, and a lot of public engagement work, including thinking of some creative uses of the material led by theatre and film practitioners that our Kenyan colleagues had brought into the group. We are still confident that it'll happen, and the university is actively in the process of seeking funding at the moment. But like everyone else in the world, we've had to adapt some of our plans and start to think of some slightly different ways of doing things. But as we get used to Zoom calls with the Kenyan team and plan our upcoming social media activity, we have one more kind of spin-off project, which is not part of BSF, but will certainly tie in with it. And we really hope it's going to engage a lot of the same people. The first Bristol Photo Festival, as some of you may know, is taking place next spring. And one of the exhibitions at Bristol Museum and Art Gallery is a collaboration between us and a Ugandan photographer who's now based in Nairobi called Sarah Wisewer. And she's going to be exhibiting some of her fantastic images, like this one of a ballet class on the notorious Kibera estate. And these will be shown alongside a selection of our historic images, which Sarah's going to curate. And we feel that this combination of old and new ways of looking at African identities will be really thought-provoking. So that's just another really advanced date for your diaries, kind of end of April, beginning of May through to September next year. So the obvious point about BSF, of course, is that at the moment, it is a pilot. It's one project in one place. But in the Beck collection, we hold collections from all over the Commonwealth. And if we could wave a magic wand, we'd just have versions of this project going on absolutely everywhere. And we are determined to open up all of these collections, not just to Kenyans living in Kenya, but to Somalis in Bristol, Indians in London, and so many other people who can trace their roots back to places that Britain colonized. And we hope that the recent media focus on the importance of everyone learning about Empire story will provide us with more resources to expand this important work. Because it is important. For far too long, Black history has been pushed into the corners. And those of us who work with historic collections haven't done all that we could to stop that, far from it. The story of Empire is complex, it's challenging, it's not an easy story to tell. But that can't be used as an excuse anymore. It just isn't good enough. And if some good could be said to come out of the tragic events that led to the Black Lives Matter protest this summer, it's that awareness is slowly growing, that the inequalities that still exist today can only really be understood by all of us looking at our history. And so we're here to help. We've reopened to the public 2 days a week back in September, and an updated version of our catalogue is about to launch next week, fingers crossed, with over 7,000 images like these ones free to download, and film and sound coming soon. So be sure to take a look at our website for more news of that. Again, I think the link might be going into the chat now or soon. And if you look at our website, there's also the option to sign up to our newsletter or to follow Bristol Archives on Twitter. And that way you can be kept up to date with everything that we're doing, the launch of the catalogue, photo festival, and any new developments. So I think that is all from me for now, but happy to try and answer any questions.